Yo, YouTube, what's up with your boy, Sports and Fitness Rants? I'm back, guys. Click that like button. Subscribe to my channel. What's up, y'all? Welcome back, guys. Welcome back. Got another great video for you guys today, as usual, man. You guys know the deal on this channel. It's all about setting the record straight, stopping the lies and stopping the narratives, guys. And just put some respect on some of these guys from the past eras, man. And in this video, we're going to do a video of the 90s and the 2000s. It's not a comparison or a debate or trying to say that or make a case for one era being greater than the other. But I did that video a couple weeks back about the great perimeter defenders of the 90s and the 2000s. And like I said, it's just more of a comparison. It's more of a celebration, I guess we could say, to highlight some of these players that never really get mentioned anymore, that have been forgotten, that have been disrespected, and, basically, cast aside as just plumbers and taxi cab drivers or guys that weren't skilled or weren't great athletes. They didn't know how to play basketball. I told you, they want you to believe that the NBA only got real basketball players in the league in 2010. And over the last 10, 15 seasons. Before that, they want you to believe that these guys were not basketball players and that anyone could have walked off the street and played in the NBA. That's how they talk about these guys. And it's insane. So in this video, I wanted to continue that with the 90s, 2000s, the shooters. The good to great shooters that were in the league in the 90s and the 2000s. And once again, guys, I do this list off of guys I remember. I tried to just write their names down. And then I looked into some of these guys and their shooting prowesses, their numbers, shooting the basketball from long range or whatever the case may be. And like I said, this is just to highlight some of these guys and put some respect on some of these guys, man, that have been forgotten, man. And like I said, disrespected. And I want to thank you guys, everyone across the world, everyone across the states has been supporting my channel. Thank you very much, guys. I'm truly humbled by all support, man. It really means a lot, guys, for real, man. You guys standing up, man, rolling with me, standing up, man. We must continue to do this, right? Stop the lies and the narratives, man. And you guys know what to do. Turn the volume all the way up. Hit that play button. Remember, these videos are for educational purposes. And let's roll. So, yes, guys, like I said, man, I wanted to do another brief video in the 90s versus 2000s and talk about the shooters, some of the good to great shooters that played in these eras. Because, like we talked about, the 2000s era is probably the last great era, right? Things started to change in the late 2000s, 2008, 2009, right? And then into the 2010s, things start to really change even more as far as how the game was played, the mindset of the players, right? It just changed, man. And a lot of us will say, or you'll hear people say oftentimes, that the last, warriors of the NBA were guys like Kobe Bryant, Tim Duncan, Kevin Garnett, a Steve Nash, a Dirk Nowitzki, a Jason Kidd. These were the last, warriors, true warriors to play in the NBA, that last era. Those guys went out, and that was pretty much the end. All of those guys were tough. They showed up. They played with heart. They played with a love of the game. This is the way the game was, guys. And this is how these guys, approach the game. It was the mentality, guys. Like I said, that love of the game, that respect, that competitiveness of these guys. They were true competitors. So a lot of us agree that the 2000s is probably the last great era as far as, those players I mentioned. So the thing about the 90s and the 2000s and the shooters. Now, on this channel, I tell you guys many times, if you notice, I don't read off numbers on this channel. I don't do numbers or, talk about a lot of stats. There are some channels where they're great at this stuff. They can give you guys the numbers, the rundown, the stats, all of this stuff. And it's great, man. It's fantastic that these guys can find some of these stats and find this information. It's great. But on this channel, I've always told you guys what? I'm giving you guys the perspective, context of someone who grew up watching this stuff in the 80s and the 90s, guys. And what have I told you guys about the 80s and 90s? We did not focus on stats. It wasn't about numbers. It wasn't about the numbers for the players. It wasn't about the numbers for the fans. That's not just what it was about. So, what I tell you guys all the time is that I know these players based off of what I watch them do. They develop reputations based off of what they do on the court. So, for example, some of these guys that are shooters, I didn't have to look at their numbers to know that they were shooters. I'd have to say, or go look and say, oh, how much a percentage did this guy shoot from three? What's his percentage? How many threes did he make in a season? How many threes did he take? Blah, 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 blah. I don't have to look at that to know a guy was a shooter in the 80s and the 90s. I know he was a shooter because I watched him play. I watched him shoot, and he developed a reputation. He earned a reputation based off of that. You guys get that? Right? Like, I didn't have to know a guy made 5 or 6 all defensive teams to know he was a great defender because I watched the game. And then I'll know Gary Payton's a great defensive player. Michael Jordan's a great defensive player. Scottie Pippen was a great defender. You know the guys who were great on defense were, and then you look at their numbers and their accolades. Oh, they just happen to make a crap load of all defensive teams. It adds up. You see what I'm saying, guys? I don't have to look up stats or numbers to know about these guys. I know about them through the on-court game that I watched. I couldn't tell you their shooting percentages. Couldn't tell you how many threes they shot or took. But I know that they could shoot the ball because I watched them do it. So now with that being said, let's talk about some of these players. So the 90s guys. Obviously, Reggie Miller, right? Do I have to mention or talk about Reggie Miller in depth here? I think Reggie Miller led the league in free throw percents, I think 4 separate occasions. The interesting thing about Reggie Miller, never led the league in three-point percentage. And why was that? Because I've told you guys, in the 80s and the 90s, remember the 80s, they just brought in the three-point line. But by the time the 90s rolled around and guys were utilizing it more often, it wasn't being abused. And when you look at Reggie Miller, and then you say, oh, how come Reggie Miller never led the league in three-point percentage? Quite simply, in those eras, at that time, you had specialists, right? A specialist. Guys that were specialists. All they did was specialize in an aspect of the game. Reggie Miller could shoot threes. He might have been a three-point specialist, but he didn't just shoot spot-up threes, right? He came off of screens, always moving. Reggie Miller, watch the film. Coming off of screens. He could come off the dribble. He could come off the pump fakes, off the jab step and shoot. Reggie Miller could score from many different areas on the court, the mid-range, the three-point shot. He had the little runner in the lane, Reggie Miller. He could do different things. He was a scorer. He could score, right? He wasn't just a specialist where he was a spot-up shooter in the corner. Like a Steve Kerr, for example, was a spot-up shooter. So his percentages, the shots he's taking, are a lot different than Reggie Miller's, right? Reggie Miller's shots are often harder. He's often being guarded by greater defensive players because he's the main offensive threat on his team. Not Steve Kerr. So this is why someone like Reggie Miller would not lead the league in three-point percentage and someone like Steve Kerr would. Because Steve Kerr's three-point shots and Reggie Miller's three-point shots are completely different. Most people get this who understand the game. This is the reason why Steve Kerr has the highest three-point percentage in NBA's history, but no one's going to be stupid enough to say that Steve Kerr's the greatest three-point shooter in NBA's history. No one's going to say that. So Reggie Miller, I believe he has a career 39% career three-point percentage, which is really good, especially for the era that Reggie Miller played in, especially going against the defense that he went against, everyone focusing on Reggie Miller and the game plan. Mark Price, another guy who doesn't get mentioned much these days, one of the great point guards of the 90s, who, like I said, would probably be a Hall of Famer if he did not have some of the injuries kind of derail his career to a degree. But Mark Price, he was in that next tier, right? The Magic Johnson, Isaiah Thomas, John Stockton, right? The Gary Paytons, right? Those top-notch point guards of the 90s, the 80s. You had the guy like a Mark Price. He's that next tier. The Mark Prices, the Kevin Johnsons. He was that next tier. Terry Porters, right? Some of these other, lesser guys. This next tier. And Mark Price, to me, him and Kevin Johnson, they probably are Hall of Famers. Kevin Johnson definitely a Hall of Famer. And Mark Price is right there. But Mark Price, one of the knockdown shooters in NBA's history, guys. I believe that the league in free throw percents 3 separate times. These guys could just shoot the ball, man. Reggie Miller's money. Mark Price is money, guys. Money. I believe he had the record for free throw percentage in NBA's history until Steph Curry, I believe, surpassed him. Or maybe Steve Nash had surpassed him some years later. But it was Mark Price for years. I'm trying to think. I think he led the league in three-point percentage, I think 2 times, Mark Price. I think he's a 40% career three-point shooter for his career, Mark Price. This is a knockdown shooter. Mark Price is money. The dude's jump shot's wet. Pure shooter, Mark Price, man. Dale Ellis, another guy that would destroy this league. This era of NBA with the way these guys would have to space the floor and shoot so many threes. Dale Ellis, once again, the guy could shoot from all over the court, man. The guy was a shooter. When I talk about shooters, guys, in the 80s and the 90s, it's not just three-point shooting. These guys are just shooters. Just shooters, man. Mark Price is just a shooter, man. Reggie Miller is just a shooter, man. All right, Del Ellis is just a shooter. I believe he is a one-time, maybe one-time three-point percentage champion. I think Del Ellis, he might even win a three-point contest. I believe Mark Price won a couple three-point contests, maybe 2 3-point contests, I believe Mark Price may have won. Excuse me. Dennis Scott, 3D Dennis Scott, one of the first high-volume three-point shooters in NBA's history, guys. Dennis Scott was shooting like 8 3-pointers a game at the peak of his career. In 92, 93, 94, the guy was shooting like 8 threes a game, which was unheard of at that time. Nobody was shooting that many threes. Not Reggie Miller. Nobody was. Dennis Scott, like I said, one of the first high-volume three-point shooters in NBA's history. I believe he was a career 39% three-point shooter. And I believe he was about 6'8", Dennis Scott. So a big body, a big guy that can stretch the floor. Dennis Scott, for those Orlando Magic teams, you guys remember. Now he does he's an analyst now. So shout out to 3D Dennis Scott. Mahmoud Abdul-Rauf, who's another knockdown shooter. I believe he led the league in free throw percentage, I believe 2 separate occasions. I'm going to say he's like a 35, 36% three-point shooter. But once again, Mahmoud Abdul-Rauf, one of the first Steph Curry type players. You had him. This guy could dribble all over the court, come off the dribble and shoot these long-range shots. He could shoot from the mid-range. He could fish at the rim with the layups. So Mahmoud Abdul-Rauf, man, the quick handles, the quickness, shoot all over the place, man. He was one of the early players like this to do in the 90s. There weren't players playing like this. So Mahmoud Abdul-Rauf, like I said, he was very unique at that time. But just a shooter, guys. Drazen Petrovic, another guy. I believe he was a career 43% three-point shooter. Drazen Petrovic, the dude's money. He was money, Drazen Petrovic, at that shooting guard position. The dude was money. You guys know Drazen Petrovic. The dude can shoot. Would it be a first ballot Hall of Famer? Well, he is in the Hall of Fame, but he would have been a Hall of Famer for the NBA, not just his Euro career, if he would have been allowed to have those years and not die tragically. Because we all know that he's inducted mostly off his European prowess, even though he was good for a couple of years in the NBA. I believe 91, 92, he might have made all NBA. Then we have who I wrote down here. Chris Mullin, another really good shooter. Money. I posted that video not too long ago of Chris Mullin beating Kevin Durant in a shooting contest, right? Beating Kevin Durant in a shooting contest from 3. This is Chris Mullin, guys. And you know, Kevin Durant's a current player, still playing. Chris Mullin is old, man, and he was wet. I believe that shooting competition I think that was in 2017, so it was a couple years back. But Chris Mullin was wet, guys. A knockdown shooter. I believe he's a 38% career three-point shooter. He might have led the league, I believe, in free throw percentage one time. But Chris Mullin with the lefty stroke. And once again, Chris Mullin could come off the dribble, come off of screens, off the jab slip, off the pump fake, and can knock down shots, man. Chris Mullin, even though they tell you that no one on the dream team could shoot, Chris Mullin's on the dream team. Chris Mullin can shoot the ball, man. He could shoot. The dude averaged like 25 points a game for like 4 or 5 straight years. There was a reason why he was on the dream team. The man could score and he could shoot the ball. How about Mitch Richmond? Another guy who doesn't get mentioned much, could flat out score the basketball, could shoot the ball. Mitch Richmond, another shooting guard from the 90s, Hall of Famer, that doesn't get talked about much. They'll say, oh, who did Michael Jordan go against at shooting guards in the 90s? They downplay. They forget about guys like Reggie Miller and Clyde Drexler, and Mitch Richmond never gets brought up. They don't bring these guys up. Mitch Richmond was an excellent player, man. Like I said, he was just a flat-out shooter, man. Shooter. So shout out to Mitch Richmond. How about Del Curry? Steph Curry's dad. Del Curry, that's right, guys. Where do you think Steph Curry learned the game from? Watching his dad. Del Curry, man. But Del Curry was one of those long-range bombers of the 90s. I want to say he's a 40% career three-point shooter. I think he led the league in three-point shooting, I want to say once or twice. So shout out to Del Curry, man. Play on those Charlotte Hornets teams that were very good with Larry Johnson and Alonzo Mourning and some of these other guys that were on that team. Muggsy Bogues. So shout out to Del Curry, man. Like I said, it was just a flat-out scorer for a shooter during that time. And once again, someone like Del Curry was not going to be doing a lot of off-the-dribble shooting or things like that nature. Del Curry was more of a spot-up shooter, right? Someone you don't want to really leave open. He wasn't like Steph Curry, where Del Curry didn't have a hand like Steph Curry. That's what makes Steph Curry so unique, because Steph Curry could dribble the ball. Like, his dad can't even dream to dribble the ball that way and do things coming off of screens and all this stuff and shooting from range. His father just didn't have that ability. But he was still a very excellent shooter. So shout out to Del Curry. How about someone like Steve Kerr? We talked about Steve Kerr, a two-time three-point champ. I believe he's a 45%. Oh, yeah, was it 3-point percent? I think he might lead the NBA in 3-point percentage 2 times. I believe he's like a 45% career three-point shooter. Steve Kerr has the highest three-point percentage in NBA's history. And once again, we know what that is. A lot of spot-up shots, but he's a knockdown shooter. These guys can shoot the ball. That was their job. That was their role. This is what I'm talking to you guys. They played their roles. They didn't have to go outside their roles. They didn't have to chuck up 10, 15 threes a game. They played their role. They got to their spots on the court, and when they got a chance to knock a shot down or take a shot, they knocked it down. If you're only taking 3, 4 shots a game, you got to knock these shots down. These guys weren't allowed to take all these 3 points and chuck up all these shots and miss all these shots. If you take 15 threes, you can miss a lot and still have a good percentage. If you're only taking 4 or 5 threes, you can't miss as many. How about Dana Barros? Never gets mentioned. Dana Barros, 41% career three-point shooter. I believe he was a one-time three-point champion, three-point percentage champion, or three-point champion. Can't remember. But shout out to Dana Barros, another guy like a Mahmoud Abdul-Rauf, right? That would play that game, dribbling all on the perimeter, right? That point guard position, and would shoot these long-range shots in an era where guys did not really play that game. Once again, he was out there doing things differently. So shout out to Dana Barros. Never gets mentioned much. Shout out to Dana Barros. How about Tim Legler? Tim Legler, a three-point champion. I believe is a career 43% three-point shooter. You guys probably know Tim Legler as an analyst now for ESPN. But shout out to Tim Legler. Once again, another guy, spot-up shooter, could knock the shots down. If you left Tim Legler open, he's knocking it down. Glenn Rice, another shooter, 40% career for his career. Craig Hodges, Jeff Hornacek, Detlef Schrempf, Sam Perkins. These are all guys that can shoot, guys. Trent Tucker was a shooter. And a lot of these guys are spot-up shooters. If you leave them open, they're knocking it down. They're going to find their spots, and they're going to play their role. They're not going to go outside of their role. They're not going to try to do too much. They're not going to try to be someone they're not. They're going to play their role. And they're going to play their role to a T. And so shout out to those guys in the 90s that were just straight-up shooters. These guys could just shoot the ball. They'll tell you now the guys, those guys in the back in the day had no skills. They couldn't shoot. They could. And all those guys I named were shooters, man. And there's many other guys I didn't name. Some of the guys in the 2000s go down real quickly here. I know this video's going kind of long. Peja Stojakovic, great shooter of the 2000s, man. A career 40% three-point shooter. Played for the Sacramento Kings in the early 2000s. I believe he played for the Dallas Mavericks, I want to say, later in his career. He bounced around some teams. He's a knockdown shooter. Ray Allen, we all know Ray Allen, one of the great shooters in NBA's history. Could shoot from the mid-range, the three-point. These guys could just shoot the ball. Career 40% from 3. Joe Johnson, another guy that doesn't get mentioned much these days, but could shoot the ball. Just shoot it. I believe it's a career 37% from three-point range. Joe Johnson from the mid-range, from the 3. Just a shooter. Steve Nash, an excellent shooter, right? Like I said, I believe he had the highest free throw percentage for a while. Up until I believe Steph Curry might have passed him now. I believe he led the league in free throw percentage twice. Excuse me. A career 42% three-point shooter, Steve Nash. And we all know he can shoot from the mid-range, from 3, off the dribble, off the screen. It didn't matter. Steve Nash, one of the great shooters. Kyle Korver, a knockdown spot-up shooter. Kyle Korver, I believe it was 4 times he led the league in three-point percentage. A career 42% three-point range for his career. So Kyle Korver, once again, one of the knockdown shooters of the 2000s, maybe the 2010s, I guess you can say. Kyle Korver, man, a spot-up shooter, can knock it down. Dirk Nowitzki, knockdown shooter, right? Not just a three-point shooter, not a spot-up shooter, a straight-up shooter. Dirk Nowitzki, 38%, I believe, of his career from 3. And we all know Dirk with the one-legged fadeaway shot and his overall offensive game, his overall ability to shoot the ball at that height. really changing the power forward position, man. No one could really shoot the way Dirk Nowitzki did at that power forward position, man. The dude was just special with his shooting ability at that size, at the power forward position. How about Mike Miller? Another career 40% from three-point range. Mike Miller. Remember Mike Miller hitting those threes in the NBA Finals for the Miami Heat at an advanced age. But Mike Miller was just a knockdown shooter. Could just flat out shoot the basketball. So shout out to Mike Miller, man. Won Rookie of the Year. Jason Kapono. A lot of people forget about Jason Kapono. But he was, like, I think a two-time three-point champion in the 2000s. I believe his career 43% three-point shooter. I believe he's like top 5 in three-point percentage all time, Jason Kapono. But a lot of people don't remember Jason Kapono. I believe he was on the Miami Heat that won the championship in 2006. He was the shooter for the Miami Heat. So shout out Jason Kapono. Nick Van Exel, another guy that could fill it up from the perimeter, could shoot the basketball from the mid-range, from the three. The lefty stroke of Nick Van Exel. So I wanted to bring up a shout out Nick the Quick. Excuse me, guys, Van Exel. Another guy that can shoot the ball. Brent Barry, another guy that can shoot. Brent Barry, Rick Barry's son, Brent Barry. You guys probably think of Brent Barry of his dunking ability, right? Winning the slam dunk contest. But Brent Barry can shoot the ball also. Yeah, I believe he's a one-time three-point champ. Shot 40% from three-point range, I believe, for his career, Brent Barry. So shout out to Brent Barry, man, a knockdown shooter. Allen Houston, another shooter, guys, can knock shots down. I believe he led the NBA in free throw percentage one time. I believe he's a career 40% three-point shooter. Allen Houston, man, like I said, these guys are not three-point specialists. They're not just three-point shooters. These guys are shooters. Mid-range, from three, it don't matter. These guys can shoot the ball, man. They're shooters. Some guys are spot-up shooters. Some guys can come off the dribble. Some guys can come off the catch and shoot. Right? Allen Houston could come off the dribble, the catch and shoot, whatever it is, spot up. Allen Houston was just a shooter, man. So shout out to Allen Houston, man. Rashard Lewis, another really good shooter for a big man. I believe Rashard Lewis about 6'10". Played that small forward / power forward. But he could shoot the ball, man. Rashard Lewis came in playing, I believe, for the Seattle Supersonics, if I remember correctly. And then he would play for teams like, I think he went to the Miami Heat. I think he was on the Orlando Magic. I believe he was on the Orlando Magic when they went to the NBA Finals in 2009, if I'm not mistaken. So shout out to Rashard Lewis, man. He can shoot the ball, man. He can stroke it. Jason Terry, another shooter from the 2000s, 38% career three-point shooter. Jason Terry, man, could just shoot the basketball, guys. So shout out to Jason Terry, man. And we all know about his prowess in the 2011 NBA Finals. He made some big shots, man, shooting the ball. Jason Terry. Another guy that's getting mentioned, Keith Van Horn. I don't know if you guys remember Keith Van Horn, man. Shout out to Keith Van Horn. The dude, I think they called him the Pale Rider or something like that. I can't remember what they used to call him, his nickname or something like that. But Keith Van Horn, about 6'10". Once again, power forward, could stretch the floor. Just stroke it, man. This guy could just shoot the ball, man. I think he's a career 36, 37% from three-point range. So shout out to Keith Van Horn, played for those New Jersey Nets teams with Kerry Kittles, and I think he played maybe 1 or 2 years with Jason Kidd there. Trying to think some of the guys, maybe Lucius Harris or Kendall Gill might have been on that team. So shout out to Keith Van Horn, man. How about Michael Redd? Another guy that doesn't get mentioned at all, never gets brought up anymore. Michael Redd from the 2000s to mid-2000s. Michael Redd, once again, another guy that would probably be known more if he didn't have all these injury problems. He had a lot of injury problems, Michael Redd, and it kind of derailed his career. But the man, the lefty stroke, could just stroke it, man, Michael Redd. I think he's like a career 38, 39% three-point shooter. But shout out to Michael Redd, man, because it doesn't get mentioned much anymore. Like I said, the injuries derailed his career, but the guy could shoot, man. He really could. Derek Fisher, one of the clutch players of the 2000s. And like I said, a guy who could just stroke it with that lefty stroke. He could just shoot, Derek Fisher, man. And he was known, like I said, for being a clutch time performer. We all remember Derek Fisher hitting that shot over the Spurs with like 0.5 seconds to go, right? You guys remember that shot. That was Derek Fisher, man. He hit a lot of key shots for those Los Angeles Lakers championship teams, man. But the dude can shoot, Derek Fisher, man. So shout out to him, Derek Fisher. And another guy wrote down here, Shane Battier. Another guy, Shane Battier. And someone like a Shane Battier was one of those guys where, like, he didn't come into the NBA as a shooter or a three-point shooter per se, but he transformed and worked on his game and became one of the top 3-and-D guys in the NBA. That was Shane Battier, one of the top 3-and-D guys of the 2000s, guys. And he developed that jump shot, especially from the corners. So shout out to Shane Battier. I believe he's a career 38% three-point shooter. So like I said, developing and working on that game, molding his game to becoming that. So I know this video went really long, guys. But as you guys can see, man, I read a lot of these names of guys. Some of these guys don't get mentioned ever. The Keith Van Horns, the Michael Reds, the Del Currys, the Dana Barroses, the Tim Leglers, the Brent Barrys, the Craig Hodges, the Jeff Hornaceks, the Sam Perkinses, Mahmoud Abdul-Rauf, Dennis Scott. Like, these guys don't get brought up a lot. Dale Ellis. No one really brings these guys up much as far as shooting the basketball. Joe Johnson, Jason Capono. Right? These guys don't get brought up much, but these guys are knockdown shooters. I'm not saying that these guys are the greatest shooters in NBA's history, the greatest three-point shooters in NBA's history, the greatest scorers in NBA's history, or the greatest scorers of those eras. What I'm telling you is these are the names or some of the names of some of the guys that I thought of that I remember being shooters, just shooters, based off of what I remember watching. More so these guys in the 90s than some of these guys in the 2000s. I was in the military in the early 2000s from 1999 to 2003. So I didn't get to watch as much basketball as I was, previous years before I went to the military. But I still was able to watch a lot of these games. But the 90s guys I know. And I know those guys are shooters. Not because of their numbers. I told you, when I looked at some of these guys' shooting percentages, I wasn't surprised because I knew that they were shooters. Some of them I might have been surprised that they were as high as they were because of the era they played in. But I wasn't surprised as far as their percentages being good because they were good shooters. And I saw them and they earned the reputation of good shooters in that era. So shout out to all these guys. Shout out to the 90s and the 2000s. Like I said, really being that last transition from one era to another. That's really the last great transition we had. When you had, the older guard, the Michael Jordans, the Charles Barkleys, the Hakeem Olajuwons, the Patrick Ewings, the Clyde Drexlers, right? The Scottie Pippins. Like, these guys getting older, the John Stocktons, and the Reggie Millers. And now the newer guard taking over, the Kobe Bryants, the Allen Iversons, the Vince Carters, the Dirk Nowitzkis, the Steve Nashes, the Tim Duncans, the Kevin Garnetts, right? These would be the guys taking the game into the 2000s. That's the last great transition, guys. The transition from 2000 to the 2010s, it hasn't been so great. In the 2010s into the 2020s, I don't know. We'll see. So much respect to all those guys. If you guys know some people I did not mention that maybe you guys can think of, put them down in the comment section, guys. Much respect to all you guys. Thank you for the support, guys. You guys know the deal, man. I'll catch you guys on the next one.